Evening, welcome to Majority Caucus. My name is Akbar Yusuf Ruhullah Khomeini. With 81 days to Ghana's presidential and parliamentary elections, Ghana's banking sector has become a dominant discussion, with the NPP and the NDC battling it out on which of the parties can be trusted in protecting depositors and keeping a strong, stable, and financial sector. We'll go for a quick break. When we return, I would introduce my guests.
A balance of music to the Shadab Transit, so bank, the music coin. One more bank of Ghana license, and now, before that, so when I prospectors go, this and a movie now, as I know music. Now, advance the whole, be able I to music or say you. I never was here. Now, one I was to the sun. Who find them was saying here. Now, I'll show you know, before about the
Welcome back to Majority Caucus. We deeply apologize to our viewers for the late start of the program. I have been joined by my guest, the Deputy Finance Minister, Honorable Charles Edubonhin, to take us through the discussion tonight. Welcome to the show, Honorable. Good evening.
Thank you for having me.
Few days ago, government released some 3.5 billion Ghana cedis to the receiver to pay depositors of microfinance institutions, and that has brought to the fore a discussion on the banking sector reforms. And you know that we're left with 81 days to elections, and people are interested to know why we got to where we are. Around this time in 2016, the then running mate and now vice president at a public lecture had predicted that 7 or 8 Ghanaian banks were on the verge of collapse. The Oxford Business Group had reported an asset quality review that was carried out by Bank of Ghana in 2015 and 2016.
Yep.
Viewers would be interested to know the state of the financial sector as inherited by the NPP and some of the challenges that you've had to deal with.
Yep. So that's the question?
Yeah.
Great. Good evening, listeners, and thanks for having me on the show. Yes, when we came into power in 2017, the industry was really in a dire state. And it was in a dire state based on a variety of issues that had culminated over about 4 years or maybe even longer. And there were a myriad of problems. But I think the asset quality review that the World Bank requested to be done, I believe in 2015, encapsulated most of the issues that were there. And you know, the technical ones, like your high non-performing loans, your poor capital adequacy ratios, and so forth and so on, that tend to imply that a bank is technically insolvent. But other than that, I think the more relevant issues were the lack of corporate governance and some of the lax practices that were being practiced within the sector, and the poor regulatory oversight, which allowed the banks to start doing things that under normal circumstances they shouldn't be doing. And a lot of people knew about these things. So in fact, you had some banks and asset managers that knew that you didn't save or you didn't put your money in some certain institutions because everybody knew that it was just a matter of time. It was an open secret in the financial services sector. In fact, there were some banks that took pride in lending to related parties. But if you're a bank and you're lending to a company that your brother owns or you yourself own, you know, you're clearly not going to perform the kind of stringent credit assessment that you would do if you're lending to a stranger. And I think that was even evidenced by how you had a lot more. All the banks that we ended up having to, or that we declared insolvent, were all Ghanaian-owned banks. You know, the foreign-owned banks, typically, the guy who runs credit will be somebody from another country who comes in. He doesn't know anybody. He's not related to anybody. So he looks at the credit application from a very professional view. Whereas with the Ghanaian banks, it's, oh, my wife I see, or my uncle, or this or that. In some cases, it was just a matter of a phone call saying, hey, look, I'm setting up this company. I need so and so to set it up. Why don't you send the money? In fact, when this whole issue started and we were closing these banks, I had a shareholder come and sit in my office in the Ministry of Finance, and I asked him, and I said, how did you get here? And he said, look, it was our strategy as a bank to lend only to related parties. I said, you must be joking. He said, yeah. Wow. He said, look, he said, Ghanaians don't pay their loans. When they take money, they don't pay. So like, if they're not going to pay, we might as well lend to the institutions that we control, so at least the probability is higher. And I couldn't believe that he could sit in my office and make such a statement.
So he took depositors' monies?
Took depositors' monies.
And then advanced these monies to companies owned by them.
Owned by them. You know, owned by them. And that is a clear conflict. I mean, the biggest conflict ever. You know, there are other institutions that took depositors' money and bought real estate, but didn't buy the real estate in the name of the company or the bank, but bought the real estate in the names of other companies that they own, and became some of the largest real estate owners in the country. You know, and thereby driving real estate prices up astronomically. There are some that, you know, took money and invested it in radio stations and this and that, and all other kinds of businesses that they owned. This was depositors' money, and this was money that depositors had given you to keep for them. There were other companies. The Bank of Ghana put 4.5 billion into these banks as liquidity support to help them to stay afloat.
It was going to be my next question,
yes,
because critics of this whole reform agenda,
yes,
have the opinion that we could have offered them bailout, yes, as it happened in many jurisdictions, notably the United States of, yes, America, where, yes, the federal government had to come in, yes, and provided some bailout to these financial institutions. So, yes, critics of the process say, Ghana could have adopted the US model, first, right, of all, to keep these banks running, secondly, to keep jobs.
Right.
Why did we choose the option of, right, having to revoke a license and in some cases cause the merger of some, okay, of the banks?
Great question. You see, the thing is, you know, when you go to the hospital, the doctor will look at you and take your temperature and so forth and so on, and make a diagnosis as to what your ailment is. And depending on whether it is malaria, they'll give you chloroquine, or it's a headache, they give you paracetamol. And there's a different medicine for every different ailment. In the case of the United States, the banking sector crisis was precipitated by a credit issue. The banks had all bought mortgage-backed securities, but they didn't realize that the underlying mortgages were toxic. So at some point, you know, they collapsed and there was a domino effect, and all these assets they were holding were just, you know, bad. So it was a credit problem. And so what needed to happen was quickly, and when there's a credit problem like that, your capital is at risk because it's your capital that backs how much credit or lending you've done. So they needed to shore up these banks to give them more capital to support this. We had a totally different problem. The banks really weren't lending. You know, if they were lending to anything, they were lending mainly, they were buying T-bills mainly, and then lending to government institutions. The main lending was to their own companies. So we're taking depositors' money and putting it into their own personal companies. In fact, there was a case where a bank took liquidity support and passed the money through to another entity to buy shares in another bank.
Wow.
You see, so what happened was that if really it was an issue of being a bailout because of credit issues, the liquidity support should have solved that problem. But the liquidity support of 4.5 billion that went into these banks did not solve the problem, because really it was a corporate governance, conflict, fraud in some cases issue. And these banks were just operating like essentially Ponzi schemes. And were collecting depositors' money, assuring them of higher and higher interest rates to attract these deposits, and using the money to do their own things and fund their own businesses, you know, and sometimes also to to pay out a depositor who had come before, they take new deposits in and pay out the other one. So it was a different problem we had here, which required a different solution. There was also the issue about regulatory oversight and the lack of regulatory oversight, which allowed this to continue for a while, whereas it shouldn't have, So that question about, if you had done a bailout, it was a bailout we did, but it was a different kind of bailout, which was tailored to address the issues that we had at hand. The U.S. system would never have been accused or was not accused of poor corporate governance practices, of having conflicts of interest, of funneling the money or siphoning the money out into other institutions and other entities. That was not the problem with them at all. It was a pure credit problem, which was threatening to create some systemic risk issues throughout the whole economy that they had to address quickly.
Yes, for people interested in corporate governance and the technicality of these issues, they would agree with you. But for the woman at the Makola market,
yes,
the most important interest of hers in this whole process is how to access her money.
Exactly.
Because she goes to the market from 8 a.m. every day, closes probably around 7 p.m., makes savings. And so government says that we're revoking license. So such a woman is interested that at the end of the process, she should have her monies intact.
Yeah.
How has government protected depositors in this whole exercise?
Okay, so first and foremost, that market woman is my mother, my grandmother, your aunt, So there are people that we know on a daily basis. And so the story is as close to home as ever. And it's something that we all, as a country, are concerned about, because a lot of these people innocently put their deposits in institutions which was regulated by the Bank of Ghana. And so the perception was that they were safe. And at no time did the Bank of Ghana come out and say, hey, you are not safe, and this company, you can't put your money in, and so forth and so on. So there was an obligation on us when we came in, because they hadn't been forewarned about the riskiness of some of these deposits they were making, for us to make sure that they were made whole. But the extent of the problem was so deep, and the cost of making sure that they were all whole was so challenging, that we had to figure out ways to be able to achieve that without necessarily breaking the bank. All in till today, we've spent about 21 billion on the financial sector cleanup. This does not even include the additional almost 10 billion we spent on the legacy debts for the bulk distribution companies under ESLA, who invariably were exposed to the banks because they had growth from the banks. And so that was part of the cleanup. If you add that, we're looking at about 30 billion. Just to put it in context, total tax revenue last year, I believe, is about 44 billion. So if your total tax revenue last year was about 44 billion, and you're spending was 47 billion maybe, and then you're spending 30-something billion just to clean up the financial sector, you can imagine the drain on the fiscal purse that we have. And this does not even, now we have to go and pay salaries, pay interest, and so forth and so on. In fact, I think the interest bill for this year is estimated to be, I think, 12 billion. I'll check it. But, so just to put it in context, it's a big check. So we needed to find ways that we could do it gradually. So when we did the 7 banks that we consolidated, or was it 9 banks, between the 2 that went to GCB and the 7 that went to CBG, those ones, at least, by not shutting them down completely, we essentially transferred the depositors and some of the assets to GCB. So maybe yesterday you were a Capital Bank depositor, tomorrow you're a GCB depositor. And hopefully you will withdraw all your money at once. So, it will take time for you to take your money out. So then all we had to do was give GCB and CBG a bond that was matched the difference between the assets, that means the value of the depositors, and the liabilities, that means the liabilities, the value of the depositors, and the assets, the value of the loans that were still valid and current. So that allowed us to address quite a significant portion of the problem without a direct hit on our fiscal in terms of actually finding the actual cash to do that. Some of these depositors, though, had fixed deposits. So maybe I was saving with Capital Bank, I put my money in a fixed deposit, and a 90-day or a 180-day fixed deposit, and they were paying me 20%. Now, when I move to GCB will say, look, I can't pay you this 20% again because it will cost us too much. It's much higher than our cost of capital. So we have to restructure your paper. I'll pay you 8% or 9%. But think about it this way. If it wasn't for us coming in, you would have lost all this money in the first place. So there were these negotiations done. The interest rates were recalibrated across the board for these depositors and were made whole. And that's something people don't realize, that they actually did take a haircut. But the haircut they took was in the form of a recalibrated interest rate on their fixed deposits. It also affected institutions. In fact, the government itself, Cocoa Board and so forth, had huge deposits in some of these banks. So they all had to come to the table and agree. Sometimes they even had to agree to extend their fixed deposit to 3 years so that they don't take all the money out immediately, so as to be able to manage it. So that was the first component we did. Then we went into the savings and loans and the MFIs, which was another huge one. But fortunately for us, with the savings and loans and the MFIs, the average deposit size was not that big. So when the receiver came in and we closed them now, and those we couldn't really absorb into another institution because the assets of these companies were next to nothing. There was nothing really there. The deposits had just been taken,
because some of them had
and they had been
collapsed,
spent.
but they were not officially declared.
Exactly. So we then had to first validate all these claims, and they had got very poor record keeping. So now you were worried that you might have some criminals who would pretend to have a deposit here or a deposit there, bring some fake claims or deposit slips that you now had to validate. So we had to go through a very rigorous process of ensuring that we validated these claims, and it was worth the process because we saved quite a bit in finding a lot of invalid claims that we had to strike out. And now once we had done that, now we had to figure out how we were going to pay them. And so we then said, okay, fine, we'll identify a paying agent, which was CBG, and we'll pay you through that. Now, when the receiver did the analysis of the claims, initially we realized that about 80% of the claimants had deposits less than 10,000. So we said, oh, this is great. The 80-20 rule, if we can take 10,000 times whatever depositors, I just give you a rough number, 100,000 or so forth, we multiply by 10,000. That is almost 1 billion or whatever. We can pay you, we can give you 1 billion and you can pay all these 80%, exactly. Then you only have 20% that are more than 10,000 that we have to deal with. So that's how we started. So we issued the first check for 1 billion. And then the receiver came back and said, this is not going to work because even though 80% of these guys, this thing, you still have quite a significant number of people who have claims that are a lot more than 10,000, who are agitating and, can't work. Also, the understanding was that whilst we were paying this 10,000, the receiver will also be working, trying to reclaim the assets and sell them, the lands and so forth and so on, to be able to then augment the 10,000 that we had given them. But half of these, not half, but a lot of these savings and loans and companies took us to court and then tied us up in court with all kinds of claims. The case in point is First Allied in Kumasi that dragged out their case for a year or more. So then we weren't seeing any realization of any income from the asset sales. So it was left to government to do this. So then the receiver came back and said, look, man, let's increase this to 20,000. So we then did it to 20,000. And then maybe that moved the number of people covered to 85% or 90%. But what we hadn't taken into account was that you had a lot of social institutions, the churches, the schools, the hospitals, and all these guys, their small savings they had gone to put them there. And if you treated every claim as an individual claim, you actually may have 1,000 dependents behind that one claim because it's for a school or something. So then the decision was made that we needed to treat different groups differently. And then we increased the deposit to 70,000 per head. So at 70,000, I believe it was I think it was 96% of all claimants,
around 95,
right, were then paid in full. you know. So we then have only 5% left. Now, in that 70,000, institutions, corporate institutions were paid 120,000. And then like the fund managers and so forth that had loaned money or placed the money with the savings and loans and so forth were also paid 120,000. But there are some of the exposures were a lot
We're
higher
running
than
out of time because we started the program so late. But let's come to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
Government has released 3.5 billion to the receiver.
Yes.
Who are the beneficiaries, and how do you respond to the claim that this is in response to the NDC's manifesto, which promised that government was going to, in the unlikely event that the NDC wins, they're going to find the money to pay these depositors. And in a panic reaction, government has mobilized 3.5 billion. How do you respond to that?
No. You know, in fact, we have, actually, as I said, we've addressed 95% of the problem and over. What was happening was that we then decided that we're going to issue bonds. So those who had a lot more than 70,000 were going to get paid in bonds. The bonds we designed were bonds that we felt would address the problem, but there were zero coupon bonds that were given specifically to CBG. So they were not tradable instruments. Because they were not tradable instruments, the only place that you could discount those bonds was with CBG. And I think maybe CBG didn't do a good job in explaining to the depositors how the bonds worked. You know, they said, okay, we can pay you over time, over 5 years. And most people say, oh, they said, they'll give us only something now, the rest you come in 5 years to come and collect it. And if they wanted to discount the whole thing, they said, oh, 50% or so forth. So it's like, oh, you guys, you're giving me only half of my money. So there was a lot of agitation around that. And so we went back and we looked at it and we said, how can we restructure this to make sure that it works? Because we really were feeling that there was no liquidity in the system. People were really struggling, and we had to address this problem. And the problem was exacerbated by this whole COVID pandemic. When we first issued these zero coupon bonds, it was in March. You know, by then, we didn't realize how bad this COVID thing was going to hit. So now you have teachers who already had their money locked up somewhere. They've gotten only 70,000. Now, on top of it, too, they've been laid off from school. They're not earning any salary. So it compounded the problem and made it look like we really needed to find a solution that provided a lot more liquidity immediately. So what we did was quite simple. We went back to the drawing board, looked at the zero coupon bond and said, look, how can we make this thing more liquid? And we realized that we could make it more liquid by restructuring it into a marketable securities. Government issues marketable securities every day. Marketable securities are listed and they trade. Anybody can buy them on the bond exchange. And by doing that, we gave CBG an instrument that they can now sell on the open market to raise cash. So essentially, all we've done is given CBG or replace CBG's zero coupon bonds with a marketable instrument, which as the depositors come looking for deposits, they sell on the open market, and so they can now credit everybody's account with their cash, and once you come and withdraw, they can liquidate the marketable securities to settle.
Yeah, I struggle to see the argument that it is in reaction, because if I remember correctly, as far back as January, the president had promised that in his New Year message that the government was working fully to pay all depositors this year, in fact, to pay them 100%, including DKM.
Yes.
In February this year, the vice president in Kumasi repeated that claim that government was working to. Yesterday, I was flipping through the NPP manifesto and actually found in the NPP manifesto that there was a commitment to raise some 3.1 billion cedis to pay depositors of microfinance institutions. So if you look at the evidence, it baffles one that when people say that it is in reaction, because the evidence shows that government over the period has been working to. Now, critical issue is the issue of jobs.
Yes.
How has it been handled in the process of the banking sector reform? Because I know, for example, there were companies that couldn't pay workers up until 6 months before their licenses were revoked.
Right.
Severance packages are an issue. How is government dealing with it?
So we have I mean, in fact, I think a lot of the workers are better off. First, between those 9 banks that were absorbed by CBG and GCB, a lot of the jobs were preserved. And then the ones that they got laid off, a receiver has made available about 150 million CDs to pay severance to these workers, which is ongoing. So they're getting paid. It took a while for the money to be made available. So there was quite a little grumbling before, but now everybody is getting paid. But it's a negotiated severance package that is being given to all those who have been laid off. So in fact, some of them are better off than they were when they were working, because as you rightly said, some of them haven't been paid for 6 months, And in fact, even the depositors, you can sit there and they don't even get their money when they go and withdraw it. And they're even paying salaries, So even though it looked rosy, there was a lot of suffering within the sector. So we've actually made it a lot better. But I think what is even more important is the savings of those same salaried workers that were in these banks as deposits. We've saved over 5.6 million depositors.
Wow. The number has gone up from 4 point something to 5.
4.6 million depositors. We've saved over those numbers. We've saved over 12,000 jobs.
People who would have lost
their money. Totally. And
I mean, imagine the chaos that the women at Makala, the women at the markets in Caucus.
There'll be riots all over.
Yeah.
Not to mention their dependents that will also be suffering.
You wake up one morning and you're told you can't have access to your money.
So if you put it into that context, the cost-benefit analysis has been immense to the average Ghanaian on the street. Even if he was not a direct depositor. Yes, we've lost some jobs, but the severance packages have been paid. If I was just looking today at the mobile money sector.
Actually, we've saved some more jobs.
Yes, well, we've saved jobs. We've saved a lot of jobs. And I was just looking today at the mobile money sector, and it was interesting because I saw that we've now seen a lot of activity move into mobile money transfers and transactions. I think last year, it was almost, 300 billion in mobile money transactions. Now, the question is that you have agents who are the ones who sell the mobile money and transfer and so forth and so on. The number of agents who are doing this has gone up by almost 100,000, within a year. So these are new jobs that have been created as more people have gone into the mobile money space. And Ghana is now the #1 leading mobile money transaction country. It surpassed Kenya. So sometimes you got to look at things in a dynamic way. It's not static. One industry dies as another comes up, and we are looking at digitalization. And this age of digitalization, that kind of bricks and mortar bank that everybody walks in, goes, stands in line, teller, it's fading away, And, I think this COVID-19 pandemic has actually made us clearly see what the future is going to look like, And in fact, if we hadn't gone through this cleanup exercise, our banks would be very hard pressed.
The IMF believes, of course, the IMF was the institution that the NDC had to hand over the management of our economy to from 2014 until they exited. The IMF believed that today in Ghana, Ghana can be said to have a very strong, stable financial sector as a result of the interventions of the government of Liquidity. They had a different view when President Mahama was in office, and they had expressed concern that
they had been pushing them to try and get them to resolve the sector, and they were refusing to do it.
Wow. And today they believe that Ghana is fairly stable. We're left with just some few minutes to end the program. And what is your view about post-COVID financial sector in Ghana?
Good question. Let me just read something here. This Renaissance Capital, one of the big banks, investment banks, research houses, did this report in March of 2020, and they say, and if I can quote, the cleanup of Ghana's banking sector is mostly complete. We believe this sets the Ghanaian banks up for the next credit cycle of a cleaner, stronger, and structurally attractive base. What makes the banking system even more appealing to us today is that while the Nigerian banks are still paying a price for that cleanup through the Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, AMCON levies, the Ghanaian banks have received a generous cleanup and recapitalization from the government with no obvious recourse risk to their own balance sheets. Late 2020 elections and coronavirus are the main headwinds to watch. They continue to say, the conclusion of the cleanup process gives the banks a liquid and well-capitalized base to ride the next credit cycle. In our view, We see credit growth at between 15 to 20% this year and 20 to 30% post-elections. And I think that encapsulates the message. What we have had missing during this 2017 to 2019 is the participation of the banking sector in the delivery of credit, especially to the private sector. And by cleaning up the banks, we have put them on a path to be able to play the role that they are destined to play in providing credit to the private sector for us to grow. In fact, because of this coronavirus, we had to look to the banks to help us give some moratoriums to some of these companies and the hospitality industry and so forth and so on. The banks came up with a package of 7 billion CDs, including new loans, deferments of loan repayments, reduced credit or restructured credit, and so forth and so on, just to support the private sector and all these pharmaceutical companies, manufacturing companies, hospitality companies, schools that were all reeling on the back of COVID-19. They could only have done that because they are now stronger, better capitalized, and able to participate in the
Thank you very much, Honorable Charles Eduboahin, for coming. Viewers, you've heard it all, that for the intervention of the NPP government, 4.5 million Ghanaians would have lost their deposits. Over 10,000 jobs would have gone out of the way. Through these interventions, we have saved these people and saved some jobs and build a very strong, stable financial sector that will contribute significantly to the growth of the Ghanaian economy. See you next week for yet another interesting edition of Majority Caucus. Good night.